I have a Python script that will uncorrupt a Flash file because I figured out the exact way that Flash is corrupting these files. It's a completely dark environment, and there's little orbs of light that light up part of the environment, and only the parts that are lit up have collision. People are like, why don't you just make this game in Unity? It would be easier. I'm like, it didn't exist. Biggest benefit to SVN is that I can get non-technical people using SVN.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Wookash Podcast. This time I'm joined by Tyler Glaiel, a game programmer who made a myriad of games in Flash back when it was cool and now re-implemented Flash engine from scratch for The End is Nigh and upcoming Mewgenics, a strategy game about cats that he's working on with Edmund Macmillan. Join us for technical deep dive into game engines and the unique world of Flash and its 200-page long spec. How did you get into games and programming in general? And then we'll go from there.
Well, I've been pretty much into games my whole life. I started programming when I was 11, or I started, yeah, 11's when I made my first Flash game.
Yeah.
It's called Pigeon Pooper. You click, little dudes would move around, and there was a pigeon that would follow your mouse, and you'd click them to poop on them, and then there were like 8 levels or something, and then you'd win. And I burned it onto CDs, printed labels for them, and sold it at my middle school for $5 a copy.
Nice. Okay.
So there's a few, there's like 8 or 9 of those out there floating around somewhere.
Okay.
But yeah, like I was 11. It would have been like 2001 or 2002 probably. So it's been a while.
Okay. I
Um,
didn't hop on the Flash development phase. I guess like I got too late to the train. Can you just roughly tell me? So many people reminisce about like Flash era. Can you tell me like how it was to program in Flash?
yeah, no, Flash is great. Everybody who ever worked in it loves it. They hate Adobe because Adobe doesn't never after Adobe bought it from Macromedia, they kind of like didn't understand what made Flash good, and they were slowly ruining it. Um, slowly. But there was Flash was an animation tool. It wasn't a game development tool. Like it started off just you could do animations in it. And they were meant to be very small stuff that could run in the browser where the files were kilobytes or megabytes in size or megabyte. They're only megabytes if you put audio in them. They're kilobytes otherwise. And they could run in the browser, and they were vector art, so they could run at any resolution and look clean and crisp and not have like video compression artifacts. That was what Flash was originally made for, and they slowly started adding ways to control the animation clips, like the movie clips are what they're called, with basic scripting. And they added a little bit of that in like Flash 3, I think was like the first one that had the ability to like click a button and have an animation play. And that was enough for people to make games in. Like I think Tom Fulp made Pico's School in Flash 3, I believe. And there was no like variables or like if statements and stuff. It was just click a button, have this thing play an animation or go to a certain frame. And like I'm pretty sure that the way that all those old like the Pico School worked was like you just put a bunch of clips off screen to like store memory, and you're like, oh, move this to like frame 2, and then a frame 2 has a button here, so then you can click that button. It's like so this is like very bare bones, but it was like
Yeah.
enough to like Rube Goldberg a game out of. Um, then Flash 4 add more advanced scripting with like variables and if statements and all that stuff. That's the one that I started with.
Okay.
Um, uh,
Okay.
and I mean, Pigeon Pooper was just click a button, go to the next frame. So that was that's all you needed. But they slowly started adding more and more scripting stuff in there where you could actually physically move things around on screen and transform them and play sound effects and all, everything that you'd expect out of, like a modern programming language. But it was never like a whole game engine. Like it didn't have physics or anything. Still doesn't have physics. Um, so you kind of still had to like just code the game itself. Like you weren't working in an engine. You could do animations, and you still had to manually move them around and test for collisions and stuff like that. Like it was somewhat bare bones throughout its whole existence. Even though they got the scripting language like on par with like JavaScript and stuff. But it was a fun time. People could make games very fast in Flash.
Yeah.
Way faster than they can now. It's weird.
Yeah.
Or we have more advanced tools now, and people they for some reason I don't think that you need everything that like Unity or Unreal offers you to like make a fun game.
Yeah. You usually need a subset of the features, right? Okay. What happened to Flash that then like changed from the inside? Because like from the outside it was stopped being supported as for browsers and stuff like that. So this is like a story that I know, but what happened on the inside of the Flash
Like the like people making stuff or like the program itself.
program itself?
Um um so basically Macromedia is the company that made Flash. They had a couple of other programs like Fireworks. I don't remember was Dreamweaver one of them. I don't know. They had like a whole suite of like Adobe, like competing with Adobe Creative Suite products, and like they had their own version of like Photoshop and their own version of Illustrator and stuff. But Flash was like the big one that was people actually used, and Adobe bought them as as companies love to do, and um they kind of just mismanaged the whole thing. So the first thing that they did was they wanted to modernize the like programming language inside of Flash, which at the time was ActionScript 2. Um that was the last one that Macromedia worked on, and Adobe switched it up to ActionScript 3. And ActionScript 3 was much more capable of stuff than ActionScript 2 because it was basically like I think the actual language dialect was like ECMAScript. I don't know what the acronym means. It's just JavaScript.
Yeah.
Um, but that was the that was what ActionScript 3 was. And with that, they kind of like abandoned a bunch of like the like easy little convenient things you could do in ActionScript 2. Like in ActionScript 2, you could take a movie clip, place it on the stage, click the movie clip, and like it would have its own little code field for like what that movie clip would do every frame. Um, and like you could put the code directly on the movie clip. It would run that every frame, and so if you wanted it to like move left every frame, you could just click the movie clip. You could type like x minus equals 5 and then go, and it would just move left across the screen. And I was like, it's janky, like it doesn't like it just sounds like the not the right way to program. But when you're making short, small games in Flash, it's very easy to understand what's happening. And then you can be like, oh, this thing moves left every frame. Copy it into a different scene, change the art or whatever, and you have another thing that's moving left across the screen. ActionScript 3 didn't want you to do that anymore because they're like, no, that's janky. That's not the right way to like that's not the correct way to program. It can be a lot faster if you have to like set up an event listener on the main timeline that listens for every frame and then makes this thing move left every frame. It's just a little bit more. Um I still, switched to that as soon as I could because it was a lot faster. And you could make more interesting stuff with it. But it definitely sort of like took away a little bit of like the magic
Yeah.
easiness of it. And like you had to actually like program stuff for real and couldn't just, you know, it wasn't animation that you could control. It was now like a whole fully formed piece of software. Um
Yeah.
and they kept adding new features and stuff, and it kept getting like when they switched to uh subscription service, like it stopped being Adobe CS6 and started being Adobe Creative Cloud. um they kind of just stopped caring about the program entirely, and it just let it rot, and it's got so many weird bugs that have never been fixed. And we could get into that because we still work in Flash today, and I have figured out some things about it. Like
What?
I have a Python script that will uncorrupt a Flash file because I figured out the exact way that Flash is corrupting these files.
Okay, how do you work in Flash now?
So Flash exports SWF files. If you play a Flash game in the browser, it's a .swf file. That is a publicly available file format. Like you used to be able to go to Adobe's website and download the spec for that file. I think that it's not on their website anymore, but there's enough copies of it out there floating around. It's not hard to find. Ruffle has backups of it. I have backups of it. It's like 200 something pages of bullshit of how the Flash file works. But you can go through that. You can be like, oh, this is how it stores vectors and animations and sounds and bitmaps and all this type of stuff and code. And there's a very lot. There's a lot that goes into this, and we can get into that when we start talking more about the end is nigh.
Okay.
Which was the first game that I released that used this engine. But I load the Flash files, I read all the vectors, I convert them to polygons, and then I can display them with OpenGL.
Okay. Okay.
Wow. Yeah.
I
so
was
it's
not
sort of
aware.
like emulating Flash. Yeah.
Okay. So getting back to the chronology, you worked on a variety of Flash games, but a couple of them, like I played, not played, but seen playing. It was awesome. The Ether game, the
Yeah.
Closure game was great. And
Yeah.
then you at some point switched to making games from Flash in C++, right?
Yeah. That
How
was
was
all
it?
around the same time. So like Closure and Ether. So I made a lot of Flash games. I have like 50 of them on my Newgrounds account. I would just post everything I made online. There was nothing that I would be like, no, this isn't good enough. I'm gonna hold on to it and work on it. I'd just be like, I'm gonna make a game, put a title screen on it, release it. So there's a lot floating out there, and I had a decent number of games from back in the Newgrounds game that got a lot of plays at the time. Let's see. Aqua Slug seems to be one of the more memorable ones. That was in 2006. That I made that in 3 weeks.
Bragging.
That one, people. I mean, that's what you could do in Flash, right? Like if you took that same like tool set and gave it to like a teenager these days and gave him time to learn how Flash works, they could make a game like that in like 3 weeks. Like that's just like Flash let you do that. It was easy.
Yeah.
But it's not a very good game by like modern standards. There's I like look at it, I play it, I'm like, oh, why did I do the controls this way? Why does the camera like lag behind and characters shoot you from off screen and whatnot? Doesn't matter. That one got a decent amount of plays, and because it actually had like characters and sound, people remember it. But a lot of it was sort of like around in 2008, which was when I was going off to college and just kind of had time to just make games almost full time. I was going to college, but it didn't really matter. I dropped out eventually, but that was when I was like off on my own and I would just make games, and that was where Ether and Closure and a bunch of the other like notable ones came from.
Okay.
So yeah.
So this was after your college or still in the college?
This was right at the start of going to college.
Okay. Having a lot of time on your hands apparently while doing college.
Yeah.
Okay. And then how did you get from Flash to C++? To me, like today it's like the two ends of the spectrum, right? Like Flash with like very basic stuff, and then C++, the most low-level way people do games now.
Yeah. So sort of like I say, like Flash it's not a game engine, it's an animation tool. So if you're making a game in Flash, you still had to code all of the game. Like it didn't do much for you beyond graphics. So it's not that far away from like making a game in C++. It sounds ridiculous to say, but it's a lot like the way that you would code a game in Flash was way closer to the way that you could code a game in C++ than like, Unity or whatever, where you're working within the constraints of like an engine that has designed all these things for you. So you don't have to think about them versus Flash, where like, oh, if I want my thing to move on a platform, I have to figure out how to collide it with the platform and resolve the collision and all that
Yeah.
type of stuff. So that's part of it. The other, but I started learning a little bit of C++ a few years earlier. And I had made a couple of like prototypes where, it's not that hard to download like SDL or something and be able to display a textured polygon on the screen. And I made a couple of little like sample games and then was like, yeah, this is very involved and they don't look as good as the Flash games and they're not as involved. So I just kind of like didn't like follow up on
Okay.
that for a while. But after, in college, we were learning C++, which I don't know how much college did for that because they were like, here's your C++ class. This is the book you got to read. And I read the whole book in like a week. And then the class didn't mean anything anymore. I'm like, well, I could have just read the book and not taken the class and pretty much got the same thing out of it. But I had made the Flash version of Closure was released in like early 2009, and this was around the time that I was starting to get into learning C++ for college after a few months of it. So I started working on a C++ version of Closure, like a bigger and better console version of that game because people liked that game. They had a cool gimmick. It did things Flash games never did before, mainly like shaders. Like Flash didn't have shaders until this beta thing that they added called like Pixel Bender, which was the jankiest like separate language that had to compile into some other file format. You had to like it was real janky, but I'm like, oh shit, shaders, I can make something crazy, and then I made Closure with that. And I have like one other small game that used Pixel Bender, and I'm pretty sure nobody else used that feature ever. So sorry to the Ruffle guys who have to emulate a whole separate thing just for like the two games that I made that used it. But that game was cool. It had a lot of potential. I wanted to make a console version of it, so I just started making a console version of it. It wasn't a console version at the time, but that was the end goal. Started making a bigger version of it in C++. And that was coded very similar to the way that I would code in Flash, where you just sort of write the code that does the stuff. There wasn't really an engine, so to speak. I had functions that could like drop textured polygons to the screen at certain coordinates with OpenGL. Eventually figured out how to do that with shaders and like various off-screen rendering things later down the line. But it wasn't like an engine. It was just kind of like, code that says for all these things, draw them, call their render function, for all these things, call their update function. There's like one big file with like a million stages. There's no game object management or anything, or querying or like broad face collision or whatever. There's a lot to talk about that game because it was a technical mess, even though we were nominated for a technical excellence award at the IGF in 2010. That game was a big mess.
Why do you say it was a mess? Because to me, it was like, I talked to Billy Basso, who made Animal Well, and he said that initially he started to do this like general purpose game engine and did a lot of abstractions, and at some point he got stuck because it was just like he didn't even know what to do with it. He just wanted the game engine, and he scrapped that, and he started doing Animal Well. It was directed just the stuff he needs without these abstractions, and this allowed him to go like to the finish line to complete the game. So this seems very similar case as to, but you say there was a mess. So what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, so when I say it's a technical mess, this is the main gimmick of Closure. For those who've played it, is that it's a completely dark environment, and there's little orbs of light that light up part of the environment, and only the parts that are lit up have collision. So there's you can have a light here, you can have a character here. They can't go through the wall because the wall is lit up. Move the light out of the way, they can go through the wall because there's no light. And if the orb is like in a solid chunk of ground, then it's a circle, and you can stand on it like a circle. Like it's pixel perfect collision detection on shapes that are generated by the lighting. It makes sense when you look at it.
Yeah.
And play the game. It's a cool concept. We made a puzzle game out of it. But the the way that I was doing that was not the right way to do that, and it's been like a nightmare for like long-term support on the game, where because I was like modeling it after how I was doing it in Flash, where like I wanted a bitmap that had the collision on it, and then you test pixels on the bitmap for like, oh, is this pixel solid? Is this pixel not solid? And in order to do that on Flash, which Flash did everything on the CPU, so there wasn't like a bandwidth issue moving stuff back and forth. I could just be like, generate the lighting on this thing, which is not shown, compare it to the background, and then I get a bitmap that's the actual collision. In the Flash version, it was limited to a small circle around the character because Flash was slow. In the C++ version, it does the whole level because I could do that now, and there's a lot of cool stuff that happens when you can actually do it fully. But the key thing is I was rendering the light on the graphics card, and then I was reading it back from the graphics card every frame, and that light was needed for the collision.
Okay.
So that's not the right way to do that. That's not how I would do that today. There's so many issues with that made it a nightmare to like sync things properly, and like it goes against how graphics cards work like entirely.
Yeah.
Like you lose all these things, like there are all these things that you don't think about with a game where it like buffers multiple frames up ahead of time to make sure that the game runs smooth or whatever. Like it can't do that when I'm reading a texture back every frame that is needed to generate the next frame.
Yeah. Because
So
generally you want to have your logic on CPU compute stuff, and then once it's rendering time,
yeah,
pass stuff to GPU and never read back from the CPU.
yeah, you never want to
So it's
read
like,
back from the GPU.
yeah,
So
okay.
that's what I was doing for the code here, and I like it's definitely the wrong way to do it. And I was able to get the game running 60 FPS on a PS3 eventually, but it required a lot of I had to have it be like delayed, like the information was delayed by like one frame so that I could render with the texture, start the read back, and then as the frame was rendering, and then have it by the next frame. So there's like a 1 frame delay there. I had to shrink it down as small as I could get it, because if it was too much information, it would take too long to read back from the GPU.
Okay.
The PlayStation 3 version was the real issue because it wasn't exactly a new console at the time that I was working on that. So it was even weaker than the average yeah.
How would you
PC at the
do it?
time.
How would you do it now? Well, on the CPU?
I would just do the lighting on the CPU.
Okay.
Like just a CPU renderer for the lighting, send that to the GPU and use it for collision. I'm pretty sure that even in the for like the PlayStation 3, I'm pretty sure that would have been fast enough there. I wasn't using any of the like 6 like SPU cores on the PS3 because I read the documentation on that. I was like, I don't get it. Like how do I do anything with these? So I just didn't. So I just used the one like weak CPU is like the only thing that was running the game.
Okay.
But I'm pretty sure that I could have done a CPU renderer and made it fast enough and then not dealt with that. But
Okay.
the other issue is that GPUs are all slightly different, so they don't render the light exactly the same way at the time. So there was issues where if people had like an AMD card, the light would be different and the collision would be different. So the game wouldn't run the same on different PCs.
What do you mean? But like the data is data, right? So if you pass the data to GPU and you have a buffer of fixed size and fixed type, so what would be the different?
So the lighting was rendered with a shader, and I was using it doesn't even exist anymore. I was using NVIDIA CG for the shaders in Clojure. And some of the GPUs would want to use half precision floats, and some of the CPUs or GPUs would want to use full precision floats.
Okay.
Um, so
Okay. So you have different data
so
types depending on the
yeah,
GPU.
depending on what,
Oh
like the
boy.
shaders would
Okay.
they would just compile to be different depending on the GPU. And if it
Okay.
was the wrong one, and I don't remember which one was the wrong one, whether it was the halves or the full precision floats that were the wrong one. Um, whatever one AMD cards would use, because I never noticed this on NVIDIA ones. Sometimes if it was dropping the precision or increasing the precision or like using less bits for the texture or something that it would just do internally, the light wouldn't work. They would not line up correctly, and there were just levels where, oh, there's no light under me, and I just fall through, die immediately, reset the level. Um
Okay.
just dealt with it.
Okay.
It was a nightmare. Like this is what I mean when I say it's a technical mess. Like this it's just I didn't really know how GPUs work when I was coding it. So I never coded anything in line with like how the graphics card wants to work. I'm just like, I could do it this way. I'm gonna do it.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Then moving forward, you worked on Bombernauts in Unity, right?
that was started working on that sort like a close to few months after Closure was released on PC.
Okay.
So
So first question is about comparison between Unity and C++. Like your subjective take and what is the, what are the advantages and disadvantages of both? Like how do you feel in the both worlds? And then I'd like to talk about networking a little bit.
yeah. So Bombernauts was, I wanted to make something in Unity. I wanted to learn Unity because Unity didn't exist. I mean, I think it did exist, but it didn't like really exist when I started working on Closure. So people are like, why don't you just make this game in Unity? It would be easier. I'm like, it didn't exist. I had to code it myself. But it exists. By the time Closure was done, it existed, and I'm like, I should probably learn this thing just in case it's I like learning things. I like knowing all the different approaches people can take to making games, Flash, C++, Unity, Unreal, puzzle scripts. Like I like understanding all the different ways that there are to do something so that I can, have a better idea of what I want to do, what works, what doesn't. And so Unity was sort of a chance to learn a game engine that was professional and like somebody else designed, and it had a bunch of features. Like it had all the stuff built in that I would have liked to learn at some point, but didn't want to like. I wanted to actually. I like making games, so I wanted to actually make a game and not just work on engine stuff forever. So Unity could do 3D stuff. It could do networking stuff. It could do um, game object management, supposedly pretty fast at stuff, supposedly. Um, it had like this component based design thing, which is interesting. Which I like. I like the component based stuff. I don't I have issues with Unity, but like the general like workflow for how building a game object out of a bunch of subcomponents works is pretty nice. Um, but anyway, so Bombernauts was like it was a short, meant to be a short little project, kind of like a side project. Like I wasn't ever full time working on Bombernauts. Um, it's a simple multiplayer game, no local multiplayer, only online multiplayer. Uh, where it's like a small voxel grid, and you throw bombs around, which can knock players around and blow up the voxel grid. It's a fairly simple concept. There's some power ups that make it more complicated and tile types. It's a fun game. I like it. People liked it. It didn't sell very well because it's a multiplayer game, and you have to kind of like hit a critical mass of people playing for a multiplayer game to take off. But it did eventually, make back what I spent out of pocket on. Um, but yeah, Unity. talk about Unity a bit. Unity purports to like do all this stuff for you and like be a game engine. And when you're working in Unity, what you realize is that at least at the time, which was like 2013, 2014 was when I was working on Bombernauts mostly. Um, it wasn't very Unity, like none of the individual pieces of it were like quite good enough for production. Like they were all good enough to get going. Like you could get something on screen. Like I had like a prototype of Bombernauts working like within a week, basically, or a couple days, where like the game was basically there. And then trying to like flesh it out, you're like, oh, the way that they handle input isn't really good enough because you can't remap controls easily without having to like launch by holding a keyboard combination using their like built-in thing, and even then it's not like good. So like, oh, there's a Unity asset out there on the asset store that you can buy that does a better job of it. So you buy that and you use it, and you're like, oh, okay, well, the UI is not very doesn't work very well in Unity either. It's kind of ugly and not easy to customize. So there's some other asset out here that you can buy to do UI. So you buy the asset, you redo your UI in that asset. You're like, oh wait, this asset for UI doesn't it works with Unity's built-in input thing, and now I'm using a different asset for input that is not Unity's built-in input thing. But so there's like some way to like interlock them that is way more complicated than it needs to be. Um, so you do that and then you hook it up and then like, oh, this UI thing is like not supported in the latest version. You're like, oh shit. Like, oh, the rendering like for Bombernauts, the lighting needs to be at an angle for the art to look good, but the shadows need to be straight down for gameplay reasons. So you can see where you are above the map. That's like just standard like platformer stuff. You want the shadows straight down. Um, but lighting straight down looks ugly. So it's like, oh, can I do that? Just is there a way to do that by default in Unity? No, I gotta like write my own set of like shaders to handle it, and I have to like write my own shadow caster so that the light doesn't leak on the sides of these complete vertical walls because they never wanted you to make voxels in it or whatever. And so I wanted the art style, like all the shaders for the characters were rewritten to use this sort of like paletted lighting thing that makes it gives us a lot of control over how stuff looks. Um, and it's like, oh, the networking was, fine for like a demo that you upload to a website or whatever, but like you can't ask people to type in an IP address to connect to.
Yeah.
So it's like, all right, how do I do actual networking? Oh, you can't. You have to download this fucking asset, a different asset that's not the built-in Unity stuff, and redo it there. And then I'm like, well, I want it to work on Steam, and Steam has so the Steam API has like a set of networking functions that connects to a Steam username instead of an IP address, and they go through whatever Valve's NAT servers are or whatever.
Okay.
Um, so that you don't have to do port forwarding, you don't have to have people set up stuff. It's very nice stuff. Like Valve they make multiplayer games, so they have that shit like unlocked. Very cool. How do you get a Unity asset to like connect through Steam instead of an IP address? Oh, the asset doesn't do that. There's like 3 different ways to hook the Steam API up to Unity, so the asset doesn't handle it. So what I did there was I bought an asset that had a reasonable amount of source code, called like TNet or something, and I dug around the source code of that Unity asset till I found the part that makes sockets. Deleted it, replaced it with stuff that connects through Steam sockets. I had to rewrite a bunch of other shit in that asset as well because we had a destructible environment and that did not sync. Like the asset was not storing like a full packet history for connecting new players. It would only store the most recent packet per game object, which I guess works fine in like a shooter where there's nothing significant changing over time. It's just like, oh, this character's here, they're here. I don't need the old packet. But the environment that is destructible needs all the packets so we can reconstruct the current state of the environment.
Yeah.
So I had to like rewrite like the part that syncs new players so that it could handle that. Um
So you basically
So
rewritten like most of the systems that you were given by Unity, and this was early in the Unity's life to also like
yeah,
be fair. But the networking stuff, it like I guess it was like up until 2020 when like something from Unity was released, but then like still the same networking that you knew from like beginnings of Unity, like it was up until a couple of years ago still like the main one to do from
yeah,
Unity.
yeah. It's like that. What it felt like was by the time that Bombernauts was done and released into early access on Steam. That's why the release date's a little bit odd on the Steam page because it was released in early access, and then I just marked it as done in 2017. And I'm like, I'm not gonna. I've done everything that we originally promised, and I can't keep adding new stuff to a game that nobody's like buying or playing. So,
Okay.
but by the time it was released, it had felt like we had rewritten almost all of the things that Unity promised to like do for you. There was like I wasn't using their collision detection or physics because I as a game designer, I sort of care about like the exact motion paths that objects take, which are not physically accurate because the feel, you know, a physically accurate like projectile or like it doesn't feel right for a game. Like
Yeah.
Bombernauts especially, where the whole gimmick of the game is you're throwing bombs that can knock people off the map. There's like a whole bunch of like complexity in there over like when you gain control back in midair and how much friction and drag you have midair and like it's just a lot of stuff that I know how to handle if I'm just writing the code to like do that myself, but I can't figure out how to like finagle a physics engine to feel correct in that way and also to collide correctly against like a grid, which physics engines don't like that voxel grid. They would want everything to be a cube. But you could do a much more solid, robust collision detection on an axis aligned grid that is very simple, just point probes or whatever. But yeah, almost everything eventually got rewritten and replaced with like custom code. And
Okay.
um so the game still took a long time to make just because I still ended up having to do all the work that I would have if I had made it from scratch. Although being able to like get a prototype running of a multiplayer 3D game in like a few days is good. Like there's no no doubt about that was a big benefit of using it.
This was
Um
the first and last Unity game that you were working on, right?
yeah. Um I'm not against using it in the future. I don't particularly like it, but my game engine's very 2D oriented, so if I was gonna do something 3D, then I would switch to one of the other. I would probably switch to one of the other engines, depending on how involved it is. Like if I'm making a big 3D game that needs actual graphics and stuff, then it's kind of hard to just staple that onto a 2D engine. But I really like the way my engine works, so it's kind of like maybe I just won't make something big 3D or
So
with
let's
this engine.
let's talk about this. Your engine, you mean the engine you made for the end is Nigh.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit. Paint an overview of the game like you did for other games. You've done this brilliantly, and then we can go into like the engine specifics.
Yeah. All right. So the End is Nigh is a platformer. That's the best way to describe it. Like it's a platform. It's not a complicated game. There's nothing crazy about it. I made it with Edwin McMillan in like 9 months. Um,
Really?
there's yeah. So we were working on other projects before the End is Nigh that didn't pan out. People remember Ouroboros and ask us about that a lot, and we're like, no, uh Ouroboros had a cool gimmick where it's a visual gimmick, so I can't really describe it, but you would um it was like an infinite zoom kind of thing, and you were playing on like the inside of a ring in 2D
Okay.
where um it made people motion sick. That's the kicker here. There was unavoidable if people playing it were like, I'm motion sick from this, and you're like, all right, well, you look up how motion sick works, and they're like, oh, we're doing everything wrong if we're trying to make people not get motion sick from this game. There's no way around it. Um, that particular gimmick, that game would make people motion sick. Nothing we could do. to not have that happen. Um, but that was like the first uh like intended to be released project that we were working on in my engine, which I had been tinkering with on and off since like 2010 or something. Like the engine has a history, but we were working on Ouroboros in that engine, and we basically just cut it and we're like, we can take the platformer controls from it, which feel good, and we can make a platformer out of it in 9 months. Um, the engine had not, I had not shipped a game in that engine yet, so uh, actually having a project that we needed to ship was very useful in like adding all the finishing touches onto the engine that were needed to actually ship a game into it. Um, but you know, when you're when you're like, I need to ship a game in this and I know what needs to be done in the engine, I can just go write the stuff. Like I don't have to like dilly dally around with like, oh, what's built in, what's not. Is there an asset that does this? Like I know, oh, there's no UI thing. I got to go write a UI thing, and I
Yeah.
can just go write a UI thing. Like it saves you time to like know that you have to do something from scratch.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I'll rewind a little bit on the engine because the engine is the like core thing that made me want to use a custom engine was the ability to import Flash graphics and use graphics from Flash in like an actual game engine.
Okay.
Because Flash graphics are fucked up. They don't make sense. They were not designed with like graphics cards or CPU, like modern CPUs in mind. They were designed for like in like 1990, like 3 or whatever, to like run in a browser or whatever.
When you say you wanted to have Flash graphics run, you mean the stylistic way or more like the properties like vector graphics and then easy scalable?
I mean, we wanted to use Flash for art because the workflow for animating in Flash is very nice for games in a lot of subtle ways. Um, and it doesn't work the same way that like what's the one that people use for 2D in games? It's like Spine, I think.
Okay.
Spine 2D, which is like a skeletal thing, or like sprite sheets, or like 3D skin meshes or whatever. Flash doesn't work in a way that's compatible with any of those sort of like ways people usually make art for 2D games. Um,
Okay.
so trying to like use that, like there's a reason why no game engines out there just import Flash files and let you use the art.
So
No commercially available ones.
can you walk me through the workflow then, like step by step, so that I get this right? Because you mentioned how Flash worked in the beginning, but now with the workflow,
Yeah,
like if you want to add a character and then have it animated, how it would work like?
yeah. So Flash has there's a display hierarchy in Flash. There's a timeline with frames, and objects can be placed at those frames at different transforms and like color transformations and moved around and deleted and re-added, or you know, if you're doing frame by frame animation, every frame is its own drawing. And that is called a movie clip, which is a timeline that has a bunch of objects on it at different positions on different frames. And the editor also lets you like do like tweens between where you know you have an object here on one frame and here, and it'll go. Um, that is a timeline, and that's an object. That is itself, that is a movie clip in the library, which you can then put in the timeline of another thing. So
Oh,
you can
okay.
have like an orb that has like a swirly animation on the inside of it, that does all sorts of crazy things. You can then make a character holding that orb, and you can drag it from the library into their hand and animate it as a part of that character, and it has its own internal timeline that is has its own animation. And people who do art in Flash, this stuff nests deep. Like this, like they're all independent timelines. They don't have to match up the length. So like one of our animators on Mewgenics loves using this trick where he has um you know a thing with like a 20 frame animation embedded inside of a thing with like a 33 frame animation, and they're like co-prime numbers or whatever. So the action, so it doesn't loop until you know multiply those two numbers together. Like it
Okay.
won't loop for a long time. People like
Okay.
doing those types of tricks in Flash to do crazy animations and stuff. You can also name them, and then you have like a code hook for that sub object, which you can look up. You can traverse the tree, find like the thing named orb, and you can just set its frame to whatever you want, or
Oh,
um
okay.
from the base level. So if a character is like holding an orb and you want it, it's like a red orb and like a green spiky orb or whatever, you can put all those on different frames in that object, and then the code can be like, change the orb to frame 2, and then they'll be holding a spiky orb instead.
Okay.
Um, the orb is the obvious example of how that's useful for games. But if you're making games in Flash, you're doing that on more than just like a thing that's held in their hand. You're like, oh, this eye wants to blink at a certain time, or you want the character to like wince. You want the head to play an animation that's not with the body, or so you can have the head separated. You can swap them. Like, there's a lot of shit you can just have rigged up in Flash that is nice. And um, the other thing is that you can also tie action script codes to certain frames of animations. So when the timeline reaches a certain frame, it can execute a script. And, you know, you can do that in Unreal Engine and Unity by just
Yeah.
having like a hook to call a function or whatever. But having the code just right there on this frame is nice. The frame can control the timeline of another object. So, um, or its own timeline. So, we have for like an idle animation where you want the character to randomly like go whoosh, or whatever, like you can have a point, like an action script code that's like, if there's a random like 90% chance, set the timeline back to frame 1, otherwise let it go through. So then it just will loop the first part of it randomly 9 out of 10 times, and then every now and then it'll let it go through. Um Entirely within the animation system. Like no fancy code needed on the other level of things. Um, there's a lot of
Nice.
little tricks. There's a lot of other little tricks that go into it, but fundamentally, that's how the workflow of Flash. That's how Flash workflow goes. You can do a lot of stuff that revolves around animation with not a lot of code needed. So usually animators know how to do this in Flash. Um, and this is not it's not easy to understand how to like do that on a GPU with C++ because it's not it's a yeah, there's a lot of object creation and destruction going on.
So
Um
maybe let's back up now. The Andy's Nigh already had this in the engine.
yeah, so I had the engine working. Um it had been developed. I'd been poking around with rendering flash art in 2010, put it on hold because I had to finish Closure. Um Even though it would have been very nice to have for Closure because we were still doing animation in Flash. We just had to export them to sprite sheets and paint them in Photoshop or whatever. Pain in the ass. Um, but and then I had picked it up again while working on Bombernauts to like try and make it better and make it like production ready. And um Ouroboros was a prototype that was using it, and I eventually switched the engine to use that sort of like composition, like component based thing that Unity has, where you can create a game object out of a bunch of subcomponents. Switch it over to use that because I like that workflow. Um, Sometime in the middle of working on that Ouroboros prototype, and then switch to the end is nigh. Okay, we got to make this game. Engine is it's not locked down, but like I'm not gonna like do any major changes to it while trying to like finish a game in it. So finish up, add all the things that it was missing, like audio and um controls and stuff, and finish up, make the end is nigh in it. Um,
Okay.
but the Flash stuff was working mostly at that point,
For
minus
the
some features that were not supported in the end is nigh.
for the Flash engine in general, you reworked you mentioned the spec that was floating around on Adobe,
Yes.
not anymore.
Yeah.
So you understood like 200 worth of pages to understand how the format works, and then to
Yeah.
do that in C++, and then also figure out how to do it, for example, GPU, to make things faster and doable.
Yeah. Basically. I mean, I didn't read the whole 200-page thing because it's organized like, oh, here's the part that is the fucking like text layout engine or whatever, which I did eventually have to go and do, but not for the end is nigh. There's a bunch of shit that Flash lets you do. Like there's like a whole video, like Flash video was a thing for a while. That was how YouTube got started, was Flash video. They converted
Yeah.
videos to Flash so that they could run on any browser window because browsers didn't have video at the time. So there's a whole section of the Flash document about FLV like videos and all that shit. You don't need to know any about that, so you can just skip over that section in the doc. It's
Okay.
fairly well organized. There's a bunch of fields. They're like, here's the header for this field, and then here's the values, and here's how to read them. But there's a lot of, it's ancient tech that was meant for squeezing things down to kilobyte size. So there's a lot of shit in there that's like, read 3 bytes, add 2 to that. That's how many bytes each element of this row of this matrix is. Read those bytes, or like bits, not bytes, like bits. So, you're like,
Okay.
okay, I gotta be able. I can't read bytes in a stream. I have to figure out how to read individual bits, like 3 bits, then 5 bits, then 5 bits, then 5 bits, and then sometimes it realigns it to the byte boundary after that, and sometimes it doesn't. Um, Sometimes there's endianness on integers, and sometimes there isn't. I have a fucking note in my engine for one of these situations where in one place there's a 64-bit value being read that is little endian, and I don't remember which endian it is, but there's 2 different spots that read 64-bit values, and one of them is little endian and one of them is big endian. It doesn't tell you that in the doc. You just have to be like, oh, why is this one crashing? Can I just flip the bytes and have it work? Guess so. Um,
Okay, how
but
much of the engine is the actual Flash integration?
um, at this point, it's probably like 25 or 30% of the engine.
Okay.
Like it's a significant part of it, but uh, the Flash code is very isolated, and there's not a lot of individual pieces to it. It's just some of them are complicated.
Okay.
Like I need to be able to read vector art, um, like the vector art shapes. That's fairly complicated because there's a lot of substructures there, and when I wanted it to handle gradients and bitmap fills and stuff, there's some parts of it there. So that gets somewhat complicated. There's taking the vector paths and tessellating them into triangles, which has a couple of steps on it because the vector paths are all Bezier curves, quadratic ones. Very nice. I don't have to deal with any higher order ones, just quadratic. Even though the Flash itself has cubic curves in it, like you can edit them as cubic curves. It divides them all up into quadratic ones when it exports, which is very nice.
Nice.
Makes things simple there. So there's some complexity in converting those to triangles and tessellating them. And I'm running through a library for that, like libtest2. There's some complexity in uh the outlines, which are different from the fills, because the outlines have like caps and joins and stuff. Which I have a library that does that mostly, that seems to match what Flash does very closely to like Clipper 2 was I think the library name. Very cool. One header, one source file that can like dilate lines and like
Nice.
offset shapes, which is a very nice thing to have. Matches Flash mostly. There's certain things like I can't figure out how to get like the end caps to be different on each end of the line. Or just whatever, just don't do that in the Flash art. It's not an issue. But the then there's some code for like the timeline control in Flash, which the way that the timelines work in Flash is that they're stored as like instructions. So it's like create objects, remove object, modify objects with like parameters for like position and name and stuff. There's and the animations are just a big sequence of those instructions, and some of those instructions are like next frame. So you do all the ones that you need to do until you hit the next frame instruction. Then you can wait. Then you can process all the instructions. So the next frame instruction
Okay.
Wait, so it's sort of like um this is part of why it's difficult to like map this to like a GPU thing, because this is very linear forward. Like you can't go backwards with this method. You can't like it's not storing like here's where this object is on frame 4. It's only storing how to get from frame 1 to frame 2, and from frame 2 to frame 3, and from frame 3 to frame 4. So um like like if you're doing a skeletal animation in like a 3D thing, you would have your whole animation. You'd be like, I need to display this at time 4.86 because that's the time it's going to display on the GPU. You could then math out exactly where everything would be at that time and render it like that. Can't do that with Flash. You can try to flatten it out, which is what an earlier version of this engine did. Like you tried to be like, oh, I can just go through and create my objects and then map them to where they are on these frames by just processing all this stuff, and then have a thing that behaves like this other, like the way that games normally want to do. And it just doesn't. It like works kind of, but there's a lot of things that Flash does in those like transition states that don't map exactly to that style of thing. And then the sub animations is an issue because you can have objects with their own internal timelines, and those objects can be deleted and replaced, and the timeline has to reset internally when they do that, but not if it loops back. Like if it's here and then it hits a loop point at the end and goes back to the start, does the timeline have to reset there, or does it keep going? Depends on what happened before. Like, so to actually have it all match what you animate in Flash, you kind of just have to do it like Flash does it,
Okay.
where
Okay.
you process all the commands that Flash has in order linearly. And I have more tricks now to now that I understand the format better. I have more tricks so that if I wanted to go to a specific frame, like set it to frame 800, that I can do that without going through all the intermediate frames. Because I understand the format better, and we found some undocumented values in the Flash file that help with that. Which
You,
I would ask the Ruffle guys about that, because I do know the Ruffle guys. Ruffle is the Flash emulator that can run Flash files in the browser with JavaScript, HTML5 now. I know the guys who work on that. I was like, hey, this value on this object is being set, even though it's just a value that's for shape tweens, but there's no shape tween here. Do you guys know what this value is doing? And they're like, I had no idea. And so we figured out.
you're one of the most knowledgeable person in the world about this spec now. Most likely number one.
Yeah, there's I'm not number one on the spec. The
Okay.
guys who make Ruffle know it better at this point.
Okay.
So I talk to them a lot about the Flash stuff, because I'm one of the there's probably like 4 or 5 people that are actually doing this kind of engine.
Okay.
The main Ruffle guy works for the Behemoth, so they have a similar thing. So I know they know what they're doing there. They're the
Okay.
ones I talk to most about it. But yeah, I was talking to them like, what's this value doing? And they're like, we don't know. And they're like, oh, this value, which is supposed to be um it's called ratio, which if you had a shape tween, it's supposed to be the portion, like, the percent between the start and the end. But it was being set on things that are not shape tweened. And it was significant. And the value that it was given was the frame number that it was created at. Kind of.
Okay.
So it wasn't documented, but this value was being set, and that was what it was using to determine if an object was the same on a different frame in the future.
Okay.
So
But
so
okay,
you
when
could
you say it wasn't documented and you discovered the value, I thought you were like re-implementing the spec. So from where did you find out that Flash is setting this value when you were the one who was re-implementing the spec and there's no value and no mention about this in the spec?
the value is in the spec
Ah,
because
okay.
it's for something else. But I was noticing when like stepping through in the debugger that this value is getting it wasn't just being set to 0 on this object Um, there was actually it's one of those things where it's like you have to read one bit to determine if the value exists, and then you have to read the value. And that one bit was being set, so it was hitting this piece of code that was
Okay.
like, this value is being set. I'm like, why is this value being set? There's no shape tween here. Why
Okay.
am I getting a shape tween value? And it's not like a 0. It's not giving me a garbage value. It's giving me a significant value. Um,
Okay.
so
Okay. Nice.
figured out what it was doing with that, and then the Ruffle guys reverse engineered it by like putting that value on things and seeing what was happening in Flash itself, and they're like, oh, if you set this value, it's resetting the timeline because it now thinks it's a different object or whatever. Like
Okay.
it's complicated, but yeah.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. This we talked about. The end is nigh. Making platformer.
yeah.
Apart from the Flash part of the engine, are there some cool aspects of the engine that were dedicated to the end is nigh that you want to highlight?
The End is Nigh is a very simple game because it's a platformer. So really, kind of like it's kind of just like a it's like a like dog fooding my game engine, where it's like we need to make a game. We wanted to make a platformer. Um, it's a good platformer. Like it's fun. It was sort of a follow up to like Super Meat Boy in that sense because we made it right after Team Neat fell apart. So I was working with Ed on Ouroboros, and um that got canceled because it made people motion sick, and we spun off the stuff we could into with the end. But the actual game engine there, it's like the Flash stuff is like the main
Okay.
important part of the game engine there, and the rest of it in the end is nigh. Like there's a lot of little tricks and stuff where it's like, oh, I can put all of the geometry into one large vertex buffer instead of a bunch of small ones, and then I don't have to swap it around as much. Which became more relevant in when I was in Mewgenics because I have significantly improved the engine since then. But there's not like anything beyond that for the end is nigh that was special, other than just figuring out all the ways to have components communicate with each other and stuff like that.
Okay.
Like I liked the way that Unity does component based stuff where you're assembling stuff out of smaller components. I know other game programmers are like, oh, it's kind of unnecessary or complicated, but it's useful. It lets you reuse code all over the place, which is good. And if you do it right, there's not much of a performance impact on it. I don't think Unity really does it right. um, but at least in my engine, doing like get me the camera in the scene is like a constant time thing, or
Yeah.
amortized constant time. But doing a query like that in Unity is not constant time. It should be. You can do it constant time. You can just store a list of if you have 600 object types, you can just have 600 lists of those objects, and it's not a big deal. Unity doesn't do that for some reason.
Yeah.
At least they didn't at the time. There was always like, oh, don't do find object by type, or don't do get component. They're slow, and you want to cache your results. So I'm like, why?
Yeah, but it doesn't. Yeah, it does. Like for camera, you can say camera.main, for example, and this is like a lookup for a property. But for the game object
Yeah.
find
So
by
the camera
type,
dot
it's a
main, that's not necessarily a lookup for a property.
what?
I don't at the time. It might be. They might have it cached these days, but
Okay.
that is C#. So camera.main can have a getter and a setter implicitly in it when you access it. So it could be
Yes.
doing it like camera.main could be doing find object of type camera, return the first one when you type .main.
Yeah. Okay, that's true. Okay.
So it's not necessarily as simple as a lookup in Unity. They hide shit.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
Okay.
they
Okay.
definitely there was
Yeah.
yeah, they definitely do that. They did that stuff back then, but it should be a constant time thing.
Okay. Now, Mewgenics, the upcoming game everybody's
Yes.
excited about. So
Yeah.
let's paint a picture. It's a different type of game. and you have the same engine, so I'm very interested how you squished it and changed it towards to
Yeah.
feature Mewgenics.
Mhm. Yeah. So, I mean, it's still a 2D game. It's an isometric game, but I'm not using any depth information for the rendering. It's 2D. It's positioning everything on the CPU the way that you would in like a Flash game, kind of. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than a Flash game at this point. But after The End Is Nigh came out, I wanted to work. You know, the way I work is like if I'm getting stuff done and I'm feeling productive, I just keep working. Like I don't want to stop working. So after The End Is Nigh came out, like after like a week later, um, once all the bugs and day one patches and stuff were fixed, I just wanted to keep working. So I just started the next version of my engine, clone the project, and I'm like, here's all the things that I was annoyed with in The End Is Nigh that I'm gonna fix now. And
I
I'm like,
wanna,
so I'm like,
I
Terry,
wanna, I wanna interject here for everybody who is not familiar with
yeah,
game industry. If you would be working on a Witcher 3, you would have like 6 months of huge crunch and then have like 6 months of like time off to get back your social life, get your act together basically. And you're saying that like week after releasing a game where you obviously had a lot of work to get it done, you were already prepared to work on a second version of the engine. You already had excitement
yeah.
and wow.
I mean, I
Okay.
took a break eventually, but like I had energy from working on the game that I still wanted to use. So I didn't want to take a break. I'm getting stuff done. I'm coding stuff. I want to while it's all fresh in my head, I want to fix all the issues that I had with it. This is how I work. You can do that when you're an indie. It's I If you're working for another company, I don't know if I'd recommend like giving another company your time if you're not getting rewarded for it like that. But when you're working for yourself or with like in like a partnership kind of situation, like I can do what I want with my time. I want it to work. So there's I'm not the type to like redo code while I'm trying to ship a game. Like I want to get the game done. Everything that I want to change builds up in my head while I'm working on it. And then by the time I'm done, I'm like, okay, now it's time I can actually go fix all this shit that I was annoyed with. Um, so
Okay.
that's what I did. And like one of the things was so Adobe got rid of ActionScript 2 in like when they switched to one of the Creative Cloud versions. Like after CS6, you can't export ActionScript 2 anymore. My old engine, the script hooks were ActionScript 2, so I needed to go to ActionScript 3 if I wanted to keep up with newer versions of Adobe Animate, which they suck. They're all worse than CS6, but CS6 is getting old. It doesn't run as well on like a 4K monitor and stuff. So I had to tear out the ActionScript 2 stuff and replace it with ActionScript 3, which has um it's a lot more complicated than ActionScript 2 from like the file format um way. Like ActionScript 3 has like a whole bytecode interpreter thing and a separate document that's like 600 pages for that. And I don't need it to emulate all of it. All I need is for I the only thing I need is to be able to be like this function with these parameters were called on this frame. So the I write that in Flash and I implement the opcodes until it stops crashing and I'm like, cool, I've done the minimum that I need to get these script hooks working. And then they just forward to C++ and I do whatever I want in C++.
Okay, nice.
But then there was that. I wanted to get gradients working, which I did not have working in The End Is Nigh. um I wanted to get bitmap fills working, which were not working in The End Is Nigh. And then those are the main ones. I got those in, and then I redid some of the game object management stuff and renamed a few things. Like I had this thing called an entity manager in The End Is Nigh, and which is like a collection of entities. And it turned out that it was useful to have more than one entity manager, so there was also an entity manager in The End Is Nigh, and after it was done, I'm like, these are dumb names, so I changed it to scene and director, which make a lot more sense. Scene is
Nice.
a collection of game objects, director is a collection of scenes.
Nice.
That makes more sense. That's just a renaming thing. But
Do you work
yeah.
alone at the engines in the engine world?
Yeah. So I mean, Ed is an artist. I work with Edmund on these games. Edmund McMillan on both of these games. He's an artist, not a super technical person, but I can get him using some of my data files usually fine. He's not going to ever touch C++ code or any actual like code, but if he's just copy pasting stuff and changing values, he can do that. But for the most part, the end is Nigh was just me and Ed, and then a musician for music and a sound guy for sound effects. We have more people working on Mewgenics because it's a much larger game. Most of them are artists and animators, though. So,
Okay.
um,
Okay.
it's still, for the most part, the engine is entirely me, and the gameplay code on Mewgenics is like 95% me. The other programmer we hired is doing a little bit there, but is mostly for like implementing things that can be done in data files only and not that much C++.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
but
So this means that entire engine is in your head, and also the names
yeah,
probably like are stuck. So this is fine. Like you can remember stuff, but
right.
like onboarding a new programmer to help you work on an engine would be tricky thing to do.
Yeah, probably. I mean, so when we've had it ported to like consoles and stuff, like somebody else does that, and they wrangle it good enough. I mean, all the OpenGL stuff is in like one folder, so you know most of the game object management stuff they don't need to touch. They just need
Yeah.
to be like, oh, I just gotta rewrite this OpenGL stuff to whatever the Switch uses or whatever the PlayStation 4 uses or whatever.
Okay.
Um, the real problem with like the engine, if I was gonna have other programmers work on it, is that there's a lot of things that are like, yeah, I know that I can't do this in this way because of the way the memory is laid out or like the lifetime of this object or whatever. Like I know I can't do it's hard to come up with an example off the spot for this type of stuff. But there's a lot of like there's knowledge that's like I know is would crash the game. Maybe not now, but maybe in the future if I was doing things in a certain way. And I know this operation is like n squared if I do it. So I have this alternate one that's not n squared that you do it instead. Um, and having somebody else work on that, there's just like there's no good way for me to communicate all of that. Like I can't even come up with examples of it on the spot. I've
Yeah.
just been working in it for years at this point. I know how it works. I know all the pieces of it.
What version of C++ are you using?
I just use the latest one. I like my features.
Ooh, okay. So what
Yeah.
features of the modern C++ are you using and fan of?
I love lambda functions. They're
Okay.
so good. I don't understand people that are like people who are anti-modern C++ have never like used some of these features properly, I feel like. Lambda functions are amazing. I like there's no reason why you shouldn't be using them in a code base. Like they make the code easier to read than C functions because you can just put the function where it's relevant. Like you can be reading a code, you'd be like, oh, this button, when I click this button, it needs to do a function. And if you're doing that in like the C style where you have like your function up here for on click button, and then you make your button down here and assign it that function. When you're reading the code, you're like, here's a function, and you have to jump to the function, read what the function does, and then jump back. Whereas if you just, and this function is going to be a one-off thing if it's like a on click button kind of thing. But if it's a lambda function, you can just put it right there. You're reading the code. Oh, I'm creating a button. What does the button do? It does this. And then you can keep reading the code.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Okay.
I like my lambda functions.
I think Lambda, generally speaking, people like Lambdas, but they hate C++ syntax for Lambdas. That's the thing.
Yeah, it's annoying. You get used to it though.
Okay. What else?
Like it's not like function pointers are probably like just as annoying as lambdas.
Yeah, what are
Um.
the what is your stance on the smart pointers versus raw
Oh no,
pointers?
I don't use smart pointers.
Okay.
I like having control over my object lifetimes.
Okay. Directly.
So I'm not a fan of smart pointers just because it says I don't care about the object lifetime. Hold on to this until nobody's looking at it anymore. That doesn't really sit well with me.
So how do you
Um,
manage life cycle of the objects?
For the most part, so I have the director and the scene and the entity, which is entity is a collection of components. But the components don't belong to the entity; they're in the scene in like a big list of components. Um,
Okay.
so and they're all sorted so that all the transforms are next to each other in memory, and then all the renderers are next to each other in memory, and then when you're updating all the components in order, it'll naturally hit all the transforms first, and then all the renderers and stuff like that. But when I create or destroy a game object, it'll create and it'll destroy all of the components that are associated with it. So that's one way of handling lifetime. As long as I destroy the game object, everything that was attached to it will also be destroyed. And then the scene itself can also just be destroyed. So if I put a bunch of game objects in a scene, and then I decide, oh, it's time to go to a different scene, I can just destroy the scene. Everything it owned is dead. Lifetime controlled. There's not a big deal in leaking a game object in that situation. Like if I have like a bullet that isn't destroyed, it doesn't matter. When the scene is destroyed, that bullet's gone. So that's sort of
Okay.
the lifetime management there. I have a few other mechanisms for like I have a special type of pointer that points at an object and can tell if the object was deleted underneath it. Which is useful for gameplay code where it's like I am watching this object because I need a reference to it, but if that object gets killed, destroyed from something else, I need to know that it's not there anymore. Um,
But as a
Happens a lot in gameplay code.
static thing, or like
Yes,
that.
it is. It is a. There is no. That is it, at this point. That is a plain old data thing, which doesn't require any. It requires a constructor, but it doesn't require a destructor or a copy constructor. I'm using uh generative arenas for that.
Okay.
If you know what that
Okay.
is. Basically because I have a memory manager for or an allocator for every individual object type, I can just store in the memory slot a generation number before the object in memory. And then the pointer that's looking at that object just has to store the generation number
Okay.
in the pointer. Um and then it can tell if it's looking at the same objects by comparing the generation number.
So like halfway in to garbage collector world, right? Re-implementing garbage collector.
No, this is just an arena allocator.
Okay. Okay. But you're
The
tracking.
garbage collector is manual life or is automatic lifetime
Yes.
control. This is just um I need to know if the object I was looking at was deleted.
Okay. Okay.
This is there's no garbage collection or memory management here. There's no like stop the world anything. The pointer is looking at a piece of memory. It knows that the 8 bytes before the memory it's looking at are the generation number. So it's like this object's generation number is 4. When it's looking at that memory, oh, the generation number is 5. That means the object was deleted and a new one was put there, and the generation number was ticked up.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
So that's how that works. It took a few I was doing it a different way before I learned about that, and I was like, hey, I can just staple this onto my memory allocator and have all this like it doesn't need a constructor or a destructor or a hash table or anything like that. Is just store a number, compare the number, copy
Okay.
it with memcopy, and it'll work. Um,
Okay. Okay.
but yeah, I
Uh,
don't like smart pointers. I don't like weak pointers. Maybe that's because I was like had issues with them in like Unity and Flash all the time and whatnot.
okay. Okay. Do you use? How do you stay up to date with C++ features?
I usually try to like read the document that like describes everything that they're adding.
Okay.
Um, or at least like an overview of it. It's harder these days. I mean, there's like endlessly waiting for them to like add reflection into the language. Um,
Okay.
and I look at the proposal for it. I'm like, oh, that's how they're doing that. Like, goddamn it! Like it's dire. Everybody hates C++ for a reason.
Yeah.
The people working on it don't seem to understand like the use cases. I use what I can if it makes sense though.
So
I'm not one to stay away from it.
would you be willing to switch to other alternatives for the next generation of the engine, like Odin, Zig, Rust, or Jai from Jonathan Blow?
Um, Probably not, just because there's a lot of code at this point, and I'd have to translate it to a different language. And a lot of that code is kind of C++y in a way that doesn't translate easily. Like I do have a lot of templates and macros in there. Mostly because I like templates and macros. I don't like them in my I don't like that I don't like seeing them, but I like how I can use them to hide things. Like and like get rid of certain classes of bugs by not needing to copy paste things in three spaces. Um like because I have a component, like all my engine uses modular components to assemble game objects. So everything that is a component that is hooked up to the system, I define with a macro that is component, which is a replacement for like class or struct. I do component like transform, and then if it derived from something else, then also the one it derived from. And in that macro is a lot of like ugly shit. Like it's deriving a templated class that has like parameters on it that hides a bunch of boilerplate. There is some there's a place where the template is like it's like setting up a bunch of like statically valuable like strings and functions and shit. It's all hidden in that one macro. And there was in the end is Nigh version of the engine, that macro was not a replacement for like the structure definition. That was, you had to make your structure or your class, and then you had to put that macro in there and have the name of the class in there, and that macro would just have all the functions that the component needed defined in it. Uh and there's an issue there because now you have the class name and a macro that has the class name, and you have that piece of information in two spots,
Yeah.
which means you could have an issue where you didn't copy pasted it and didn't change the name. And yeah, it was actually in three spots because there was also like an enum that was different at that point, which I got rid of. So new version of the engine, I only needed in one spot. There's no chance for like a copy paste error in that case.
Okay, but then how do you sleep at night knowing that you have this like giant macro that if push comes to shove and you need to debug this or like add things to it, it's a bit of a mess.
No, it's all in the macro. I can add stuff to the macro. It's fine.
Okay.
the
So
the
it's not
functions that the macro defines are never going to be hit by the debugger. They're all like static eval things, like give me the
yeah.
string name
Yeah.
of this class or give me the ID number of this class. And they're all statically evaluable. They all get like compiled out in the end.
Okay.
And
But
all of that is located in one little spot in the code, and it works, so I don't need to touch it.
okay. Okay. But then I assume that like the macro itself is quite difficult to work with in terms of like the length of the stuff that it's doing or not.
If I'm editing the macro, that's the case, but
Yeah.
it's not difficult to work with on the gameplay code side of things.
Yes.
I just use the macro, and then I don't have to worry about any of the boilerplate that the macro is doing for
Yes.
me.
Yes.
Yeah, that
But
is a big deal for me.
okay.
There's a lot of stuff in Mewgenics. There's a lot of gameplay. The gameplay code in Mewgenics is massive. I can tell you the number of component types I have in Mewgenics. I'm looking it up right now. User component types.h. It's the file that a Python script generated. So I don't have to maintain this one. I'm not showing you the file though. Almost 2,000 types of components in Mewgenics.
Okay.
Every one of those is defined with that macro.
Okay. That's a lot of
Yeah,
stuff.
it's a lot
Okay.
of stuff. It's a big game. There's a lot of stuff in it. Um, part of the reason why I like this engine is um because it lets me do a lot of stuff, a lot of different things, which is kind of like the core like tech problem in eugenics to solve.
How then, how much of the actual code is now the engine, and how much is the gameplay then?
For eugenics, I would say the engine is maybe 25% of the code and the gameplay is 75%, but I haven't added it up recently, and a very large portion of the Mewgenics gameplay code is in data files that are not C++. So
Yeah. Okay.
I count those as code because they're, it is code, but it's not like C++ code. But there's um there's thousands of things in those data files,
Yeah. Okay.
and they get
Okay.
compiled down. They're built out of these 2000 ish components that are in the C++ side of it. Um,
Yeah. Because I'm guessing like if the game has a strategy components, you have a lot of numbers to tweak, and this is what generally speaking lives in the data files.
yeah, the data files are enemies, bosses, abilities, compound passives, and levels and stuff. Levels are not. I'm not counting those because those are binary files. But everything else, there's just so much stuff in data files because it's a strategy game, and all the items and all the mutations and all the uh various like how to generate maps and whatnot.
Okay.
It's all in data files. We have something like for active abilities. The last time I counted, we have almost 3,000 active abilities in the data files. Um,
3,000 different
3,000.
abilities.
Yes, sort of.
Okay. Okay.
Um, a lot of them are very similar to each other because they're for enemies. But there's something like uh for the ones that your player cats can learn. There's something of like 600 700 active abilities, and they each have an upgrade that is technically a different ability. Um,
Okay.
because the upgrades are not just number tweaks; they have behavioral changes. So the upgrade, every ability that the cats can learn is two abilities. That's you get to like 1,200, 1,400 abilities from that. Then most of the items have an ability associated with them. Most of the enemies have like two or three abilities associated with them. There's a lot in the enemies and bosses that are just copy paste because it's like, oh, this one does a melee attack with a stun. This one does a melee attack with a stun, but the animation name's different. Yeah, copy paste, whatever.
Yeah.
There's some things to help with that, but there's a lot of stuff in the game. Like that's the like I say that the core tech problem for Mewgenics is this is a huge game with a lot of stuff, and I am for most of the development I was the only programmer on the project. We have one more now, but for the majority of the development, I'm the one doing this stuff. How can I like design the engine, the gameplay side of the code, and like the data files? How can I do this in a way that I don't go crazy?
Do you plan to make the source code public at some point in the future so that people that can see this? I think this would be a very interesting thing to see too, because like it's all in your head and you adapted the gameplay part, you adapted the engine part to fit the gameplay part, and it like flows through very, very smoothly. So, what do you think of it?
I'm not super interested in making it public.
Okay.
Um, there would be like the circumstances would have to be right. There's no monetary reason for me to make it public. Because people who would like this engine could also probably just use Flash or like Adobe Air or something. Like there's a couple of people that would want to use this engine for a production thing on their end. It's sort of hard to like charge money for like it would require upkeep on my part to like have it be other people using it. So it's not something I could do for free. Uh so I would probably have to pay somebody to maintain it for me. And if there's only 5 to 10 other developers that would find this engine useful, it's kind of hard to pay someone to maintain the engine like a decent amount to do that and then
Yeah.
make that back from 5 other people who would have to be paying a lot to like handle that. And then I'd have to be like, oh, well, now my engine, which is made for my games, very specifically for my games, hyper optimized for the way that I work, I have to now accommodate other people's needs in the engine. And I don't want to make it general purpose. It works because it's not general purpose. So what am I going to force people to be like, oh yeah, no, fuck it, work my way? Like, I don't know. There's just a lot that I just don't want to deal with for making it public. I don't want people to be like, oh, why can't I look up this thing and then look up this thing and then set like append this on this list while I'm there? Like, I don't fucking it's my engine. Just don't do it.
Okay.
You know?
Okay. How much percent done is Mewgenics?
We are putting the finishing touches on it. It's not time wise, that doesn't mean anything because the finishing touches are not the end of the development. But I have working on the last couple of bosses and mini bosses. We're done with all the cat ability. We were done with those like last year. But we're almost done working on bosses and mini bosses. I'm all done with enemies, so almost all the like adventure part of the game is in place. There's 2 bosses that need to be animated still, so I'm waiting on those. Animation is just by far the biggest bottleneck on this project, by the way. It's not the code, it's not the design, it's the animation. When it comes out, people will play it and they'll see it. They'll be like, oh yeah, there's a lot of animation in this game. But the bosses will take a while. They take it probably takes like 2 weeks. These are the big end game bosses that are not animated yet. So it's gonna take like 2 weeks to a month for each one of those to get like fully animated. But we have 2 animators working on it, so hopefully we'll get them within the next month or two, and then I can code up those, and then I should be done with bosses and enemies, and this polish and balance, and um, I have to go back and add like gamepad controls to the game. That's not in there yet. It's a mouse controlled game. That's gonna be an ordeal. It's gonna take a long time to test and balance a lot of the stuff at the end of the game because it's a long game. We have people playing it. One of our testers hit the 3rd act of the game at about 200 or 300 hours into the game.
What?
It's a big game. Okay. I'm not exaggerating there. But just the fact that in order to test this late game content, people need to put like hundreds of hours into the game to get to that point to test it in context. It's kind of makes it slow to iterate on that stuff. But
yeah,
it's all doable. We'll get it done.
Okay. So when?
When? Oh, hopefully this year.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. It'll be done this year for sure. Like it'll be 100% done this year for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not hopefully the release is this year as well, but you know, if it's done in November, it's going to be hard to release in around that time just for business reasons.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit out of this. What is your setup for the IDE and tools in general? How do you program?
I have Visual Studio Professional, whatever the latest version is. I have the Adobe suite installed. Obviously, just we use Flash for stuff, which is Animate now. I hate Adobe so much. Their tools suck. Like the workflow in Flash is you deal with it because it's cool and there's nothing that works quite like it, but the program sucks. Let's see. I have Python installed on my computer as well for a bunch of little scripts and whatnot. We use SVN, not Git. And I also have Notepad++, which is a very nice thing when I don't want to open Visual Studio, or if I want to like have two windows open and not have Visual Studio complain that the same project's open twice. Just open shit in Notepad++.
Okay.
Um,
Why?
yeah, I'm a pretty modern person when it comes to my setups.
In terms of SVN, uh, I know that Git has the issue with the large files and generally
Yep.
speaking, non-existent in game development. Is SVN any better in this regard?
So the biggest benefit to SVN is that I can get non-technical people using SVN.
Okay.
The commands make sense.
Okay.
I can be like, commit is when you want to commit all your work, click commit with Tortoise SVN is the visual thing. When you want to update the game, when you want to download, you just update it. You'll get all the things. People understand that. People who don't program, people who only touch animation files or art files, they understand how to use it. There's no issue in me getting those people working on SVN.
Okay.
It is like there's so many good, great rants about Git out there from like other game developers. Like I know Casey has a pretty good one. But there's the biggest issue with Git is that you have to like know how Git works to use Git.
Yeah.
Like you got to understand like, oh, your copy is not the copy that's on the server, and your um the push and pull, like what are they, like what, who's pushing, who's pulling, like what is it,
Yeah.
is push like from like a perspective like why is it a pull request to upload my work when pull is me taking, but there's like, oh no, you're requesting the server to pull your work to the server. It's like, I don't know, the names just suck, they don't make sense, it's stupid. It's very
Okay.
hard to get people who aren't technically minded like understanding how to like use Git without issues. SVN is very simple. It's basically Dropbox for most of these people, and it works just fine, minus the fact that like branching and merging doesn't isn't is harder on it. We just don't do that. Um,
Yeah, you might get away with it, right? Because if you have, for example, animators working on a very specific animations, usually adding animations, and then you're the one that is working on the code, pretty much nobody else touches them. So like you avoid a lot of the conflicts probably.
yeah, and even if there are conflicts, like you can just go and edit the conflicts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it works fine. Branching and merging, it'd be nice if I could figure out how to do it on SVN for like when we start working on DLCs or whatever, where I could maintain the main project separately from the DLC, but put the bug fixes. Like it'd be nice, but I'm just gonna copy the whole project file over into a new SVN folder for the DLCs.
Okay.
If I need to update the old one, I can just manually copy shit back. It'll work.
Okay. Okay. All right. I think we're reaching the end. Can you tell me if you were to meet somebody like an aspiring young developer and you'd like to offer him advice, what would you say to him?
My advice is it's always the same, which is you make a lot of games and you release a lot of games. You release all of them. Like you just make things as quick as possible. Like you shouldn't, if you're just getting started, you should not be spending months or years working on a game. Just don't. It's not a good idea. What you want to do is you want to make the smallest thing that you can possibly make in like a weekend or a week or 2 weeks, but like 2 weeks is stretching it for like early stage stuff. You just want to make stuff and you want to release it. And like you want the whole development cycle in there, from blank projects to people are playing it. The more times that you do that, the better you get at that whole process.
What tools would you then recommend for this?
I don't know, tools these, like I was making Flash games in Flash. I'm not going to recommend Flash for people aspiring developers, but um you just find something that seems easy enough and do that, and then when you hit the limitations of that tool, then you move on to something else. When you hit the limitations of that tool, you move on to something else. Eventually you can start working on like stuff from scratch, and then you don't have any more limitations.
And eventually you end up doing the spec for Flash from 200 pages document.
Yeah, eventually. I mean, everybody should do that at some point, right?
Okay, Tyler, thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was lovely discussion.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it.